Good morning, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Hawk Blogger Mornings. I am Brian Emhauser. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at Hawk Blogger. And it's not any normal episode. It is a Robert Mays Monday brought to you by Pagliacci Pizza. And Robert, man, first of all, welcome to another episode. How did your weekend treat you?
I don't know. I had another edition of the Shane Waldron experience, so it didn't go so
Mm.
great for me yesterday. But overall, fine. I'm happy to be here. It was an exciting NFL Sunday. It was a chaotic one, which when those days end and you're just trying to piece together and comb through what to talk about, I feel like by the time we get to 10:30 when we record our podcast, it's just like, oh man, I'm tired. Like
Yeah.
there's so much stuff happened today. You're trying to process it all in real time. I absolutely love it. And doing those Sunday shows is one of my favorite parts of my job. But yesterday was one of those weeks where it's just like, man, I don't even know how to start wrapping my arms around this.
This is a, it's hard to rank most surprising NFL seasons, but there's not a lot that's going to script so far in the NFL. Would you agree with that?
I think so. I mean, I think that even the teams that were supposed to be borderline juggernauts or one of the best teams in the league, even those teams are kind of faltering right now. The Niners are 1-2. It's like, all right, what do we make of the Niners? The Ravens are 1-2. I still think both of those are really good teams, but obviously they haven't had the starts to the seasons that they wanted. And so trying to figure out like, all right, who's good? Who's really good? Who can we count on? Like the Seahawks are 3-0. How real is that? The Vikings are 3-0. How real is that? I do think that we kind of get collective amnesia. And every single year we sit here in like week 3 or 4, and it's just like, this is crazy. Who could have seen all this happening? And then if you went back and listened to all of the content around week 3 or 4 for the past 5 years, there would have been something like that. Like my favorite example is in 2016 was my first year at the Ringer. And that was the year I believe that the Broncos went 4-0 with Trevor Siemian. And we were like, what is this? How real is this? And the answer was not real at all. So I think it's not interesting for your response to the first month of an NFL season to be, we shouldn't talk about any of this because there's no way to know how much of this is going to last. But part of my brain always wants to do some of that.
You mentioned the Shane Waldron experience, and that wasn't on our show sheet for today, but I know there's folks that are curious. There is a active debate going on within Seahawks fan base about, well, the Seahawks offense is, lower EPA per play this year than it was last year so far. And, they had problems in certain games last year. So all this stuff about Ryan Grubb being better and a relief from Shane Waldron is foolishness. It's all just the same. You've obviously got a general national perspective, but you also have a Bears fan perspective. What's your take so far on Shane Waldron?
I'm not enjoying it. And I think that part of the reason that I've had an interesting experience, an interesting relationship with the 2022 and 2023 Seahawks. I really enjoyed watching those offenses as someone who wasn't having to live through it every single week. And I do think that some of the things that they were doing from a protection standpoint last year, some of those interesting wrinkles they had where they had all those tight ends, I understood why they were doing it. And I think that the novelty of it is something that, again, when you're looking at it from afar, you can enjoy it. When you're doing it every single day, it's not quite as enjoyable. So all of the Gerald Everett that I'm dealing with right now has not been my favorite part of this season. But I think that what I've come to realize, and this was a process for me, is that the reason that I really enjoyed watching those Seahawks teams is that, and I kind of landed on this offseason, Geno's like my favorite quarterback in the NFL. Like that's why I enjoyed watching them, just because stylistically and some of the improvements that he's made over the last couple of years, like specific elements of his game, as a watcher and as a football fan, that was one of my favorite parts of any like study or any sort of team that I could watch. So now trying to divorce that from the Shane Waldron of it all and getting to live that without the Geno part, I think has kind of laid bare what I was actually experiencing over the last couple of years.
Well, I mean, you guys have one of the most celebrated, anticipated draft picks in recent history with Caleb Williams. He came into the NFL with some question marks about how he could work within the structure of an offense. He had some other question marks about him. How are you right now separating out what is Caleb Williams' challenges and what are Shane Waldron's challenges?
I'm it's been ugly so far. I'm not even slightly worried about what the only reason I'd be slightly worried about the long-term outlook for Caleb Williams is bad habits. That's the only thing that I would be concerned about. And there are some things over for the first few weeks of just like, this is just a bizarre miss. Like what's going on with the footwork here, just how uncomfortable he looks. That's been a little strange in certain moments, but I'm not even approaching a situation where I'm worried about Caleb Williams yet. I'm worried about the infrastructure of what has been put around him, offensive line, play calling, just every single aspect of that.
There was a time where the Seahawks benefited from having Mike Holmgren here, and it was this just warm blanket of this guy has developed quarterbacks everywhere he's been. And he will, through, if nothing else, sheer force of will, develop a quarterback. It feels like there's less quarterback developers in the NFL than there was in previous years. Even the Sean McVays and Kyle Shanahan's, they seem like coaches who can scheme around a quarterback and elevate a quarterback, but are not necessarily developing their skill as a quarterback. Do you find that to be true, or are there guys in this NFL where you're like, man, like Andy Reid probably would qualify? There are guys where you just say, hey, this is a coach that can really develop a quarterback and help them improve their skill set.
It's an interesting question, and I think that your answer to it would depend on how you would define developing a quarterback. So if you look at let's take Kyle Shanahan and let's take Andy Reid as examples. So if you look at the way that Patrick Mahomes is allowed to operate at the line of scrimmage and the ownership that he now has over the pre-snap operation in Kansas City, where he can change protections and he has a lot of autonomy, that is not something that you see in the Kyle Shanahan offenses. One of the reasons that you don't see that in the Kyle Shanahan offenses is that that's just not how the mechanics of their protections work. And I've talked with coaches from that tree about this, and they have interesting thoughts about it. So one of the reasons that they don't spend a lot of time on protections with the quarterbacks is that they think with limited practice time and just limited access to these guys, the juice is not worth the squeeze from spending a lot of time going over protections with your quarterback. I would much rather spend the time I have with the quarterback going through the mechanics and the intention of why the play is the way that it is. And somebody like Kevin O'Connell has been, guys talk about him very glowingly in this way, where he'll sit you down as a quarterback and say, okay, this is the play. This is your progression on the play. This is what we're trying to accomplish on the play and why you're progressing the way that you are. So I think in a way that is developing quarterbacks for the modern NFL, even if we're not doing some of the pre-snap stuff that we've seen in previous iterations of the league and with some other coaching trees and some other offensive systems. So it's a little bit of both. And I think that it just depends on what you want to prioritize with some of these guys.
Well, it's interesting you mentioned O'Connell. I think he was on my list for that type of description. And we were talking about the Vikings last week, and we also started this show talking about, are there any great teams in the NFL, period? Would you put the Vikings up there as the most impressive team through 3 weeks? Or if not them, who would be?
I mean, I still think the Chiefs are like the best team, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like, but if teams that have been a little bit surprising, I think it's probably the Vikings. And I think it's just a combination of a couple different things. Darnold is playing at such a high level compared to what we had seen him do in previous stops. And again, I think that is it's a lot of different things. Like, I think that there's a conversation to be had about some of these cast-off quarterbacks and what they look like in their second stops now that they're 27 years old and not 21 years old. And I think that that's a lot that's driving a lot of the surprising element of watching some of these guys, the Bakers, the Genos, the Jared Goffs, the staff, or the Darnolds, all those guys. But I also think that on the defensive side of the ball, like, they've been phenomenal. And I think that that's a combination of them having better personnel than they had last year and personnel that fits the way that they want to play. But it's also just Brian Flores being an absolute madman. We talked about this on our show, just wondering, okay, last year they were the most extreme defense that I can remember in the NFL in terms of like how they were approaching these things. As they got better players in the building, as they stepped into year 2 of that system where they got to kind of shape it, not out of desperation, but out of choice, were they going to be as extreme? And the answer is yes. Now they're just doing it with better players who better fit the vision that they're trying to execute. And I think that's the result that you've seen so far.
I want to take a moment here and close a loop that I opened last week with you. Last week, I gave you the choice of whether I should go with the limited time prosciutto fig primo, the miso broccoli, or the pepperoni. And the answer, in case you were curious, Robert, was that I ended up going with the miso broccoli, which is where your heart kind of went. It was fantastic. It was fantastic. And so I recommend everyone who hasn't already head over to pagliaccipizza.com, make some orders today. And you also, in the description of the video, is a link to sign up where you get special offers exclusively for folks that are tuning into Robert Mays Mondays. So make sure you sign up, add your name to the list, and get those special offers. So one of the things that's interesting about Minnesota is they've got great coaching on both sides of the ball. Their defense, to your point, Robert, is getting after the quarterback in all sorts of ways. The Seahawks entered this year with question marks on the edge. I think for a lot of people, that was a question. You've brought that up as well. I'll read you a couple numbers here as of this morning. These are the top few players edge rushers in terms of pressures in the NFL. Aiden Hutchinson has 25. Micah Parsons and Carl Granderson have 18. Boye Mafe checks in with 17. Interestingly there, Boye Mafe only has 81 pass rush snaps. You know, you're talking about Aiden Hutchinson and Carl Granderson having over 100. So Mafe, relatively similar number of pressures with a lot less snaps. Then you go down to number 13 on this list, and it's Derek Hall, who in 67 pass rush snaps has had 12 pressures, same amount of pressures as George Karlaftis has had with 109 pass rush snaps. What do you think we're seeing from these young edge rushers in Seattle?
I think you're seeing a promising step forward, and the arrow is pointed in a promising direction. And this week, I think, it's always hard to parse those numbers. Like if you go back and I watched all the Skylar Thompson dropbacks this morning from yesterday, and it's a lot of tight ends. It's a lot of unblocked pressures. And I think some of that is just good defensive scheme and good defensive coaching, man. And we can expect that from Mike McDonald. But I also think that if you try to separate what the positions those guys are being put in from what they look like this year compared to last year, it's obviously encouraging. Like Boye Mafe looks like a really explosive player off the edge. And I think that we've seen enough from Derek Hall to think that there are really good days ahead. So I'm not sure that if you would just line those guys up and you're like, all right, let's ask you to be Myles Garrett in a 4-man front and play against the left tackle consistently the entire game, that there are those sorts of players yet. But I think that in this sort of scheme and this sort of rotation, they're giving you what you want, and this pass rush is where you want it to be.
Where do you think the Seahawks pass rush can end up in the overall level of the NFL? Is it a top half of the league? Is it a top third of the league? Like how good can this pass rush be?
I think it could be really good, and we'll see what will happen with Byron Murphy and how long he's going to be out and what that looks like. But I think that making sure you're complementing those guys on the edge with guys on the interior, that's the most important part. And obviously Murphy is a good pathway to that. What's going to happen with Leonard Williams? I know he's a little bit banged up too, but I think by the end of this season, that can be a really, really good group just because they have so many bodies that they can throw at it. I mean, Draymond Jones collapsed Teron Armstead for a sack yesterday, or at least it was a pressure. I can't remember how that play ended up, but they've just got so many guys they can cycle in there. Yeah. So it just, the fact that they have that deep of a bench, and we're in a world now where teams, I think, are better at understanding how to deploy. If you have 3 guys that you feel good about that are quote unquote edge rushers, getting those 3 guys on the field at the same time and figuring out how to use them in tandem, I think that we've seen defenses really come to understand that. And I feel like Seattle is going to be one of those teams.
What do you feel like about the Seahawks defense, given who they've played? And we'll kind of translate it into not a look ahead to Detroit, because we'll do that in a few seconds. But, they are going to face a Lions team that has a lot more respect offensively and has a lot fewer holes. Do you feel like there's anything that is you're confident enough that you've seen in the Seahawks defense that you're like, I think the Seahawks may have an advantage in this area?
Advantage, I don't know, but I will say that I just think that they're going to be put in really good spots consistently, and they have the requisite talent. right? Like, I don't know if they're going to be a top 3 unit over the course of the season, like the advanced metrics say right now, as they play better offenses, and a team like Detroit obviously counts. But I just think that the questions were going to be, what were they going to get out of certain positions that we didn't really know coming into the year? What were they going to get out of their off-ball linebackers? What were they going to get out of their safeties? What was Tariq Woolen going to look like after a down year? Were they going to get a step forward from some of those young pass rushers where that group became a neutral to a positive? And I think for the most part, we've had promising answers to a lot of those questions. And for me, it was all about the personnel and how quickly they would take to a new defensive system. I had no doubts that Mike McDonald was going to be one of those guys who was a multiplier on that side of the ball. It was just, was the personnel going to come together, especially in some of those areas where we weren't exactly sure about it? And I think the early returns so far have been very, very good.
What else did you take away from this Seahawks game yesterday? What did you see?
It was mostly takeaways from the Dolphins, honestly. I mean, just like the fact that we have a completely untenable situation with the quarterback. It's bad, right? I mean, and I think that we talked about this on our show a little bit last night, where Tua's play style and what they asked of him were almost a prerequisite for how the Dolphins are structured and created. Their offensive line isn't very good. They've skimped on the offensive line multiple years in a row because they think that they can scheme around it, in part because of how quickly they get the ball out. Well, if you don't have a quarterback who's pushing the ball down the field when you're trying to get the ball out that quickly, then everything else starts to crumble a little bit. And I think Skylar Thompson had 42% of his dropbacks or attempts yesterday were behind the line of scrimmage. And every time he had to hold onto the ball for more than like 2.5 seconds, it was an absolute disaster. So I feel like we're seeing what happens when you remove Tua from that equation. And I think that this is a team that is a little bit too inflexible to overcome something like that, like we've seen from other teams around the league who've dealt with quarterback injuries.
You know, I should let you know, Robert, you may not know this, that the Seahawks history is tortured, especially recently with backup quarterbacks. And when I went back to look at some of the quarterbacks that have tortured this team and this fan base, one Tim Boyle came up in 2022, threw for 262 yards, 2 touchdowns, and put up 29 points. So, you know, there's some point where we're in this yeah but phase with the Seahawks fans, where it's like, okay, they're 3-0, yeah, but they you know, just held you know, the Dolphins to 3 points, yeah, but at some point, you know, you can't hold teams to negative points. Seahawks held the Dolphins to 1 for 15 on 3rd and 4th downs, which is something that's actually never happened in NFL history before. So it's interesting. And I guess one of the things I wonder about, Robert, is looking at this Lions game. The Lions offense hasn't been great yet either. They've scored 26 points against the Rams. They scored 16 against the Bucs, and they scored 20 against the Cardinals. If the Seahawks do go in and play a good game against the Lions, are we going to hear yeah buts about, well, the Lions offense just isn't on all cylinders yet?
I wouldn't do that, just because I think the Lions offense is better than better than those numbers would lead you to believe. I think that the underlying numbers about the Lions offense are still pretty good, especially if you look at the Bucs game. Like, they're moving the ball consistently. They just kept completely fizzling out in the red zone. And yesterday they had, again, a couple, like a bad Jared Goff interception where, you know, Dennis Gardeck drops into coverage. He never sees him. And so I do think that on a down-to-down basis, the Lions offense has been moving the ball pretty well, even if Goff hasn't been playing his best ball. So if the Seahawks can shut down the Lions, even if that team hasn't been putting up a ton of points, I think that's definitely going to be a situation where we look at them a little bit differently, or should look at them a little bit differently, just because so far they played against 3 of probably the worst 5 to 6 offenses in the NFL. The Lions are not that, even if they're struggling a little bit.
Well, the Seahawks, as you and I have talked about, have one very clear area, even while they're 3-0, that is not looking good, and that's the offensive line. And this game, you and I have talked about, hey, if you've got 2 or 3 guys taking turns having problems, that's not great. You said that. The Seahawks had 5 guys taking turns yesterday, which is even worse. Do you feel like the offensive line, not necessarily just the Seahawks, this one, but do you feel like offensive lines can improve over the course of a season?
Yes and no. I think that there are elements of offensive line play that can improve, but I think that those elements are the ones where guys are working together, right? So if you have more time on task, Connor Williams is a perfect example, right? When did Connor Williams get here? Late August, the middle
Yep.
of
Right.
August.
Yep.
So, I mean, he just hasn't been here for very long. So I think that if as you spend more time working with guys, it's like, all right, this is how we want to pass off stunts. This is what the timing should look like. I feel like that part can get better. My issue with the Seahawks is a lot of guys just losing one-on-ones. And so that part, I don't know if that gets better. I think that gets better just because your personnel improves. We've talked about this a little bit. Like, is there a moment where they just decide that Christian Haynes is going to be a better answer for them at one of those guard spots because they need more help in pass protection? I don't know. But I think that's probably the best answer for Seattle specifically, just because a lot of their issues are guys just losing one-on-ones, and that's a skill issue. That's not like a time on task issue.
So let's kind of turn our attention to this Lions matchup. And I'm curious, your outside, unbiased perspective. What gets your attention in these two teams coming up to play each other next Monday night?
I think the Lions offense is still a really good group. I just think that for the most part, over the course of this season, they've struggled to figure out who they wanted to be with their new personnel. And I actually liked their approach yesterday where they were just like, we're just going to run the ball. Like, that is just who we're going to be. And so even some of the matchups they were trying to create for Amon-Ra St. Brown yesterday and the ways that they were lining up, it's like, this feels more like the Lions offense rather than trying to force feed Jameson Williams because he's kind of a shiny new toy and we want to see what we can get out of this. So I still think this is a good group, and I still think this is a very good test for Seattle's defense. On the other side of the ball, I just am curious to see what this offense looks like against another man-heavy team, right? Like, because I just think that Grubb does such a good job with some of those stacks and those bunches and just the way that he creates separation in those moments. So this group trying to take advantage of a team that wants to play a lot of man coverage, I'm actually really looking forward to what the plan looks like for Seattle on that side of the ball.
What about the injuries? It sounds like the Lions have suffered some injuries. Sam Laporta left. Sounds like an ankle sprain. Aleem McNeil and Derek Barnes both have injuries. Unclear how those are going to be. If the Lions lose someone like Sam Laporta, let's say, how much does that change their attack?
It definitely does, just because he's a different sort of receiving option than the other guys that they can trot out there, right? Like Sam Laporta is a perfect example. Yesterday, they have him as the number one on the farther lined up furthest to the outside. They have Amon-Ra St. Brown in the slot. They do that stuff in order to create matchups for Amon-Ra St. Brown. If you don't have a legitimate receiving threat at that number one spot, if you're just wasting a guy out there, it changes the complexion of what your passing game can look like. So I think removing him from the equation forces them to be a slightly different team. Like, is that a situation where we're going to see them play a little bit more 11 personnel with 3 receivers because they don't feel as comfortable in what those 12 personnel 2 tight end looks might be? So I do think that it changes the complexion of what that offense feels like when you remove somebody like Laporta.
What is your take on those man matchups that might occur? Although Mr. McDonald has been playing quite a bit of zone as he's known to do, with with the Lions receivers, and then you've got Witherspoon and you've got Woolen, who seem to be playing at a really high level. Is there any side of that where you feel like one group or one side has a real mismatch?
I mean, right now, I don't think that there are many receiving cores that are mismatches for like what the Seahawks secondary looks like. And it's obviously this is going to be a different beast than a lot of the teams that they've played against so far. Like, when you look at it right now, I mean, I guess the Seahawks obviously, but the quarterback, the Dolphins obviously, but the quarterback play in Miami is just such a different thing. So I think that the combination of competent quarterback play plus the pass catchers, this is just a different sort of beast than something they've had to deal with. For me, the man-based stuff is when the Seahawks have the ball, because the Lions are playing man coverage on 58% of opponent third downs. Like, it's the highest rate in the NFL. So what you look like against that sort of group playing that way, the Patriots are in that general range, right? Like, they're going to be in the top 5. And I just think that that version of the Seahawks passing game looked really, really good against a team like that.
Yeah. And that's a really great point to make a second time, which is Geno Smith has historically done really well against man defenses, and he certainly looked that way against the Patriots. And DK Metcalf, now, this might be hard to believe, Robert, but this was only the third time in his career and the first time since 2020 that he's had back-to-back 100-yard receiving games. One of the things that's really been an issue for DK Metcalf through his career is catching the football. And he's had, I think, a career like 55, 56% catch rate. He's dropped a few passes against the Patriots last week. He's at like 70% catch rate right now. And he did something he hasn't done a lot, which is make a contested catch yesterday against Kendall Fuller. Do you think that DK Metcalf is taking a step forward?
I think that the ways that they're using him and some of the opportunities they're creating for him, lining him up inside a little bit more often, trying to get those chunk plays. I just feel like a lot of that is just a product of deployment and what this offense looks like compared to what the offense looks like in years past. I mean, I would have to look at the numbers on it, but anecdotally, you can probably speak to this. Like, how many times was he just lining up as the X receiver to the left side of the formation over the last 3 or 4 years? Like, it just felt like that's what he was within this offense. And I knew that there were going to be more layers to it with Ryan Grubb, and it seems like we've already seen what that's going to look like this season.
Yeah. DK has both complained and acknowledged that he's had to learn a lot more this year, but that knows that it's going to mean more opportunities. So yeah, you're 100% right. It's literally almost never happened before this season. So it is an interesting thing to monitor. We also got to see JSN show some yards after catch yesterday. He's continuing to look dangerous. And then finally the tight ends got involved. It hadn't really been there. When you look at this Lions defense, obviously Aiden Hutchinson's having a fantastic season. They made a lot of investments in the cornerback room with Terry and Arnold and who's the guy they brought in from
Carlton Davis.
Carlton Davis. Thank you. How's it going?
I think it's been okay so far. I think that Arnold it's a sink or swim defense, right? Like, we're going to throw you out there. You're going to play a lot of man. It's going to be sink or swim. And I think Arnold, he's a rookie corner like that. There's going to be an acclimation process, even for a guy drafted in the first round. And I also think him being a little bit banged up right now is part of the issue. So I think that it's going to be a volatile situation. Like, when you play that way and you want to play that way, you're embracing the volatility. And that's what the Lions have decided to do. And I feel like it's going to take a little while for them to really settle into who they want to be, just because there are so many new pieces on that side of the ball. But I think over the course of the year, the ways that they've added to that group and the play style they're trying to embrace with those guys is probably going to pay dividends.
The last two times the Seahawks have played the Lions in Detroit the last two seasons. 2 years ago, it was 48-45 Seahawks. Last year it was 37-31 in overtime to the Seahawks. What do you think happens in this game?
It's a great question. I feel like I'd have to look at it. I think that game was early in the season last year.
Both of them were early. Similar situation to now.
So if you look at the Lions last year on defense, had a pretty significant shift about halfway into the year. Like, if you look at what they were doing in the first half of the season, it was a lot more zone. It was a lot more quarters, and they just never really took to it. And I think at a certain point, Aaron Glenn was just like, screw this. Like, I'm not playing this way anymore. I don't want to play this way. And we're not playing well while trying to be a little bit more passive and a little bit more safe in some of the coverages that we're calling. And so I think that you're going to see a different version of the Lions defense than you did last year. But if I remember correctly, I do think that the Seahawks did a really good job of, and this is, you can still do this to the Lions. If you put out heavy personnel and you have 2 tight ends in the field, 3 tight ends in the field sometimes, as we know that group really loved last year, and you get base defense on the field for the Lions, you could take advantage of them. Like, the linebackers are the worst things that they have in coverage. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Seahawks were trying to do a little bit of that again, even if their offense looks a little bit different, and even if the Lions defense looks a little bit different.
Yeah, we're talking to Robert Mays of The Athletic, and it's interesting, Robert. I mean, Kenneth Walker is hopefully going to be back for the Seahawks, and I think would be play a role in testing those linebackers in coverage. And yeah, the Seahawks last year, for those that don't know, had Jake Curhan and Stone Forsythe as their 2 tackles in week 2. So they're familiar going into Detroit with an offensive line that is suspect. and coming out with a win. So it's going to be a really fascinating game. I think you may be there. I am going to be there. So we'll have to figure out how to coordinate this show next week. But before I let you go, checking in on the 49ers. You talked about it a couple times. I've asked some questions about where this team is, and specifically defensively. I'm going to read you a couple numbers here. Right now, 49ers defense, NFL rank in points allowed, 23rd, yards per play allowed, 30th, yards per pass allowed, 30th, EPA per play, 25th, EPA per rush, 29th, sack rate, 23rd. They've had injuries, but most of them have been on the offense. What's the case to be made that this 49ers defense is going to get better? Is it just Dre Greenlaw coming back?
I think the one number that I would point to, and this is something that came up yesterday when I was looking at how some other teams are playing, they've been awful on third down, like truly awful on third down. And that is typically something that normalizes over the course of a season. I think that they're giving up like more than like 50% conversion rate on third down. That's probably not going to continue. So if you're trying to find an area where they'll get a little bit better, that's probably where I'd start. But for the most part, that doesn't solve all of their woes. Like, I just don't think from a personnel perspective, from a talent perspective, this group is the same sort of defense that we had talked about in years past. And I thought that coming in, and I think that we've seen that over the first 3 weeks of the season.
All right, Robert, thank you so much for once again coming on and telling us all things NFL. What's coming up on the Athletic Football Show this week?
Our midweek show this week is me and my good buddy Mitchell Schwartz, who played for the Chiefs for a very long time. And we're going to talk a little bit about why we think offense is down in the NFL right now and some of the things that are causing that. And obviously, I know that's been a very popular topic among the football media over the last couple of weeks, but I find it really interesting. I think that there are a ton of different explanations as to why. So we'll dig into that. We'll review 2 Monday Night Football games, which is always a fun surprise when you open the schedule, and just dig into a few more things. But that's probably where a good majority of the focus will be. And then our week 4 preview will be up on Friday.
Awesome. Well, if Mitchell's interested in coming out of retirement, I know a team that might be interested. So
I can tell you right now that I think he's doing okay.
All right, everybody. That is Robert Mays of The Athletic, brought to you by Pagliacci Pizza. Thank you, Robert. We will see you again next week.
Sounds good. See you soon.
All right. And folks, if you haven't already, make sure you sign up here for extra deals on Pagliacci Pizza. It's in the description of the video. You can get for a limited time prosciutto fig primo, the miso broccoli, or this Marionberry gelato. Get them all. Robert told us to do that last week, and that was actually very wise to recommend. So let's try to see what we can get going here for Pagliacci, and thank them for sponsoring this episode each and every week. All right, so Robert gave us a lot to think about. I'd love to hear from all of you what stood out in that conversation. Part of what I like about Robert is going to be unmoved by any of my homerish perspectives on the Seahawks. He's just going to tell you what he's seeing across the whole league. This guy is deep on each and every team in the NFL. He knows what he's doing. And I think you still get the healthy skepticism. Like, hey, let's see what this team does against better competition. Now, I'm going to hold him to it when he said, I will not do the but if the Seahawks go in and stifle that Lions offense. I won't say, but the Lions offense hasn't been playing that well. I'm going to hold him to that because I guarantee all of you that will be the national story. Unless the Seahawks, if the Seahawks go in and hold them to 3 points and they get a bunch of pick sixes, that kind of performance, then the Seahawks defense will get their due. If it's a 20-10 game, 20-13, something like that, and I'm not even saying that's what I think the score is going to be, but I'm just saying if it's that kind of game, I can almost guarantee you the stories are going to be what's wrong with the Lions. What's wrong with the Lions offense? Or they really missed Sam Laporta if he's unable to go. And it's not going to change the week after that either because the Seahawks welcome in the Giants. So it's like, if you're waiting for the rest of the national media, the rest of the world to get on board and believe that the Seahawks defense is good, you're going to be waiting a while. And when I look at this defense, I've seen, like all of you, so like so many of you, I've watched Seahawks defenses for many, many years, for decades. I'm old. I've watched Seahawks games in the 80s. I know what those teams look like. I know what each and every season looked like. The Seahawks are getting elite play at multiple position groups. I don't care. You don't have elite play. You don't have the kinds of numbers that we're seeing from the Seahawks in terms of their opponents and what they're holding them to if you're not getting elite play from different parts of the defense. And for my eyes, I think the safeties have been excellent. I think the cornerbacks have been excellent. I think the edge group has been excellent. And I think the defensive tackles have been very good. I like Leonard Williams has been excellent. I haven't seen as much from the defensive tackles as I hoped for. Still time. I have got my fingers crossed. I'm holding my breath about the Byron Murphy, Leonard Williams injury situation. Both of those injuries feel like it would be surprising if they're available for this game in Detroit, which would be a huge, huge loss for Seattle. But setting all that aside, I think the linebackers have been very good. So usually if you have, even if you're playing bad teams, usually you will see something exposed. You will see a player, a linebacker exposed in coverage. I love Bobby Wagner, and I don't want to use this in any sort of defamatory way because I really is one of the greatest people and one of the greatest players to ever step foot in Seattle. But I believe if Bobby Wagner was still here, we would have seen 1 or 2 or 3 times, even against these opponents, where they were targeting him in coverage and he was not able to keep up. We haven't seen that. We haven't seen that. We would see if Trey Flowers was at one of the cornerback positions. We would see him getting targeted. If Michael Jackson, even though I like Mike Jackson, we would see a couple of plays where he was in close coverage, but not quite there to knock it down, and the play would be completed. And you're like, darn it. We're not seeing those plays. We're not seeing guys get victimized. And then on the other side, we are consistently seeing Boye Mafe has a sack in every single game this season. Derek Hall has a sack in 2 of the 3 games and 3 sacks total. You are seeing, I thought Draymond Jones played his best game as a Seahawk yesterday. And it sounded like Mike McDonald in his show this morning, maybe not, doesn't know his whole career, Draymond career here, but he was very happy with the way Draymond Jones played yesterday. I thought he did quite well. So I just don't think that you can have all those things working and be a bad defense. Maybe that's a safer conversation for people that don't want to be too over their heels on this, but I'm coming from a place where the Seahawks defense has been one of the bottom 5, maybe the bottom 3 in the NFL for years. Is anyone saying, well, I think that's where we're going to end up again? Because I don't see it. And I'm kind of eager to see this Lions game. I think the Lions represent a really good test because their offensive line is so good and their running game is so physical. They've got great runners who they've kind of got the best of the Patriots and the Dolphins in some ways. When you've got a guy like David Montgomery, running up the middle, and you've got Jahmyr Gibbs running to the outside. They've got speed, they've got strength. That's a tough, I think if anything has shown up so far as a vulnerability for the Seahawks defense, it is run defense, specifically up the middle. That's what showed up against the Patriots, and it started showing up yesterday against the Dolphins. They just ended up not being able to utilize it enough. And Mike McDonald, even in his post-game press conference, acknowledged that they're trying to play run defense with a light box, lighter weight players, less people in there. And he talked about how hard it is to have two deep and play tough against the run. They're trying to do all of that. And this is going to be a tough game to do it. I think this is going to be a game where they're going to ask more of their corners than they have in previous games. I think they're going to have to commit more to run defense in this game. And remember, this is a game last year where Trey Brown had a sack, and then on, I think maybe the next play or the play after, had a pick six. It was the first time Jared Goff had been intercepted in hundreds of pass attempts. I think this is a really pivotal game for this team. I don't think it's a make or break game, but I do think that this is, the expectation is going to be that the Seahawks lose this game. That's the reality. I'm going to go check the latest odds, and I'm doing this over at ftnfantasy.com. If you haven't already, you can get 15% off at FTN Fantasy using the promo code HBAM, HBAM, for Hawkblogger Mornings. We'll get you 15% off. Latest odds for the Seahawks game against the Lions. Let's see. It's the last one on this list because it's the Monday night game. 4.5 points. It's teetering. It opened at 4.5. It's down to 4 in some places. That means that the Seahawks are as big of an underdog in this game against the Lions as the Dolphins were, with Skylar Thompson as their quarterback coming into Seattle this week. So that's what the perception is of your Seahawks. And some of that's well earned. The offensive line has been a problem, and it was not good yesterday. I will just want to point out Charles Cross did not play in that game last year. Stone Forsythe was the left tackle. Jake Curhan was the right. You guys want to know how Aiden Hutchinson did in that game last year? Any recollection of how Aiden Hutchinson did against the Seahawks last year? He had 6 pressures. And if I remember right, I don't think he had any tackles. He had 2 tackles. 2 tackles, no tackles for loss, no sacks, 6 pressures, and no quarterback hits. So I'm not saying that should be the expectation going into this game, but everyone's going to, the simple thing is, Aiden Hutchinson is going to wreck them. Well, let's say for a second that he does. Aiden Hutchinson had 4.5 sacks against the Bucs. How did the Lions do in that game? That was a loss. Aiden Hutchinson being an absolute beast is not enough. And I feel a little different than Robert Mays about that Lions defense. I'm going to go check this. But I'm not convinced that the changes that they've made, especially in the secondary, are working out that well. Brian Branch has been playing a lot more safety, a lot less nickel corner. He's doing fine. Brian Branch is a good player. I think that their cornerback group, Carlton Davis, is not off to a great start. Terrion Arnold has a 45 grade here. Not off to a great start. They've been playing Amik Robertson a lot at corner. Not a great player. I would argue This is the worst secondary the Seahawks have faced. Maybe the Broncos, but like Pat Surtain, I thought Riley Moss actually was in decent coverage a lot of that day. If I look at the Patriots, it's no contest. The Patriots have better secondary talent than the Lions. And then yesterday, like the Dolphins, they have a meaningful amount of talent on that side of the ball, in the secondary. And look, I mean, even with that, the Seahawks have been able to get big plays through the air. The Seahawks, I think, are second in the NFL in plays over 50 yards. You know, not a critical stat, but these aren't just like explosive plays. These are like nuclear plays. And the Seahawks have won in each of the last 2 weeks. If you're telling me that they're going to go against the least talented secondary they faced this season, one that plays more man defense than almost anybody else, which is Geno's specialty, which, by the way, is also a team that Geno's last 2 games against have been electric. If you're curious, I mean, last year, Geno Smith was 32 of 41, 328 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, 116 rating against the Lions. The year before, Geno Smith was 23 for 30, 320 yards, 2 touchdowns, no interceptions, 132.6 rating. So this was a game last year where the tight ends, Colby Parkinson made an impact. Noah Fant made an impact. And so I think you got to wonder if the Lions have enough horses to defend the Seahawks passing game. And when you look at the pass rush of the Lions, yes, Aiden Hutchinson is a beast. 25 pressures, leads the NFL through 3 weeks. Next highest is Levi Owuzurike. I think he's a former Husky, if I remember right. Yes, he is. He's got 12 pressures. And I believe he is also injured. At least he got injured yesterday. Let's see if that is correct. The note that I have on some of these injuries, Derek Barnes and Aleem McNeil, who are 2 key players for them, expected to avoid season-ending injuries. That seems like next week is at least a challenge. So that's linebacker Darren Barnes and defensive tackle Aleem McNeil. Safety Brian Branch suffered a neck injury on a helmet-to-helmet collision and was being evaluated for a concussion after the game. Sam Laporta played through an ankle injury. Left guard Graham Glasgow injured his arm. Marcus Davenport, Terrion Arnold, Dan Skipper, and Levi Onwuzurike missed snaps because of injuries. Glasgow said, I was hurting pretty good. I don't want to get into specifics, but I did not feel well, but we pushed through it, and we have a game next Monday night, so we'll be able to work through it throughout this week. Any event, back to my point. You've got one guy that is a pass rusher for the Lions. And then you got a bunch of Joes. So I would argue this might be the least impressive pass rush that the Seahawks have faced so far this year. Definitely less talented, less deep than the Broncos, no question. I think it's less, maybe it's, the Patriots would be the one where I'd say maybe not. Patriots are pretty limited. Keon White is obviously maybe a comparable one. He's a beast. Aiden Hutchinson's a beast. Geno still did pretty darn well in that one. The Dolphins, Jalen Phillips, Chop Robinson, they've got some other guys there that, Zach Sealer. So I just, I have some questions about this assumption that the Lions are clearly, the superior team. I think it is 100% going to be the Seahawks' biggest test. I think that for me, I've had the Lions as the team to beat in the NFC. Honestly, right now, if I was to pick an NFC team, I might go Green Bay. What they've done with Malik Willis is super impressive. I know it's just Tennessee and Indianapolis, but still pretty impressive. When they get Jordan Love back, it should be in pretty good shape. But Detroit is the team that I feel like is the most complete team. But I think that defense has got some real questions. And here's the thing. I think the Seahawks offense needs to win this game. That's not to say I think the defense is going to get trashed, but I don't think this is a game where you can expect to win a low-scoring affair. I think the Seahawks offense has more advantages over the Lions defense than the Seahawks defense has over the Lions offense. I think you've got two really, really good units going against each other when the Lions have the football. I think you have a more talented Seahawks offense going against. I think in some ways they're very similar, but I think that there's an opportunity for the Seahawks offense to step forward next week. And look, I mean, they know what they've got to do. I really do wonder. Everyone's going to call for Christian Haynes. Is going on a road game on Monday Night Football the best place to give him his most snaps? I don't know. Maybe. But I really like the notion. I mean, remember, JSN was not even a player last year when he went into week 2. His hand was still an issue. Like, he had that injury. Devin Witherspoon was playing his first game. He got victimized for, like a play action pass for a touchdown. I think it was a flea flicker. I'm not sure which it was, but there are a lot of differences. Derek Hall, not really the player he is now. Boye Mafe, I don't even think was starting yet at that point. It was still Darrell Taylor. A lot of differences. So, I don't know. I am like eager to see this matchup. I think that there's some parts of it that are going to be misunderstood by a lot of people. And then when we talk about the 49ers, man, enjoy every time they lose. It's just fun. And who knows? Like, I think they're absolutely a team that could dick around the whole season, figure it out at the end of the year, and still make a Super Bowl run. They've got the talent to do it. But the Vultures are circling a little bit on their new defensive coordinator, Sorensen. That's 3 games into the season. Everybody was like, Steve Wilkes was the problem last year. Well, was he? Because that's not how it's looking right now. Evidence does not seem to be supporting that theory. And then, personnel-wise, I just don't see it for them. I don't see it on the defensive line. I don't see them having the people or the coaches or the players to change how that defensive line is playing. I think run defense is going to continue to be a question mark for them. Travarius Ward got absolutely victimized yesterday on, I think, the game tying drive. Did not look good. If I go over and I take a quick look, just because why not? If I look at 49ers grades right now, I mean, Nick Bosa and Fred Warner are playing elite all-pro level. There's no one else over a grade of 70. There's no one else with a grade over 68. So where's it going to come from? I was looking at Jair Brown today. Jair Brown's giving up a passer rating of like 141. They have no safety to go to other than him. Charvarius Ward, he is giving up 100 passer rating. Renardo Green, their rookie, 40.6 coverage grade. Leonard Floyd, their big edge addition, he has a 37.2 grade and a 53.5 pass rush grade, 41.2 run defense grade. So that offense was the best offense, one of the most efficient scoring machine offenses in history last year. They're going to have to be better. They're going to have to be better in order to be a real contender. And right now, I'm just not sure that there's a story to be told for them for that to be the case. And oh, by the way, Trent Williams for the third straight week, very good, not great. His grades are in the mid 70s after being a guy that had grades in the 90s game after game after game. His pass block grade, 72. Like, that's not elite. That is a very good, quality player, but it's not elite. And they rely on him so heavily. So the one thing I think the 49ers really have going for them is I think Brock Purdy is playing really well. And I think they'll get Christian McCaffrey back, and he's a difference maker. So the offense will get better. They'll get stronger. But that defense, I don't know, man. I don't see the story there. Whereas on the Seahawks side, I look at the story there and I'm like, okay, they've been playing without Kenneth Walker. Hopefully they get him back. I think he's a huge part of this team. They will get Abe Lucas back, even though Brady Henderson reported that it will be closer to midseason. That same source said, they fully expect him to play this year. They're just being cautious. So Abe Lucas would be a significant upgrade if he was to get back, when he gets back. There's some reason to believe that Christian Haynes will take a step forward when and if he gets a chance. By the way, Dominic Pooney, the guy that everyone was crowning as an all-pro after his first game as a rookie, second game, 52.9 grade, third game, 55.4 grade. His essentially being the similar player as Anthony Bradford so far. So I also believe that Scott Huff and Ryan Grubb deserve an opportunity, some time to see if they can make some adjustments. They're in the lab. They're trying to figure this out. And I think there is a chance that the offensive line makes some strides over the course of this year. I just don't know that I see that when I think about the 49ers defense. So, in any event, I'm just happy. Happy the Seahawks are 3-0. Happy that Mike McDonald has been able to pull the strings on defense. Happy that DK Metcalf is starting to show what he can become. What a great place for him to do his Megatron impersonation than Detroit next week. I think there's a lot more upside for this team, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they can do with it. Let's take this show on the road again. Let's put it on prime time. I kind of like the idea of Devin Witherspoon, Reek Woolen, Rayshon Jenkins, this whole defense getting on prime time. There's not going to be a slow start for them. They're not going to move slowly. A game on turf indoors, that Seahawks team speed, I like it. I like it. So let's see. Let's see. I think this should be an entertaining and fun game. And if they win that game, you're off to the races. You're off to the races. Next game is a home game against the Giants that will feel very stressful because it's like, oh my God, I can't lose that one. And then you have a short week welcoming in the 49ers. There is a very realistic chance you could be 5-0 facing the 49ers for them coming off a short week. And we'll see. Just looking ahead real quick, the 49ers will have hosted the Cardinals on that Sunday. So another division game. And then they're going to go on the road 4 days later and face the Seahawks. So I like the Seahawks being at home two games in a row there, hosting the Giants and then hosting the 49ers, than I would like the other way around. So that will do it for this Robert Mays Monday episode, brought to you by Pagliacci Pizza. If you have not already, please go over to pagliacci-pizza.com. Think about getting one of these limited time pies. You got miso broccoli. You've got prosciutto fig primo. They've got a Mama's meatball with Mama's little peppers on there. They have got this Marionberry cream gelato. All of this limited time. You know you want it because I know I want it. So come on. Help us out, help them out, and help your tummy out with some Pagliacci Pizza. Go to the description of the video, sign up for exclusive offers from Pagliacci Pizza just for all of you. You can share it with friends and family, but don't share it any further. PagliacciPizza.com. Really appreciate their support of the show. All right, everybody. Thank you all for tuning in. I will talk to you later today. For now, I am Brian Emhauser. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at HawkBlogger. This has been episode 183 of Hawk Blogger Morning.